Good evening, everybody. I'm Peter Cowie, and I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of the School of Global Policy and Strategy here at UC San Diego. And we are very grateful that this 5th annual meeting of the Science Policy Fellows Forum could be held here at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And I'd like to say a special thank you to our host, Margaret Leinen, who is the Director and Vice Chancellor of SIO. Thanks very much for having us here tonight, Margaret. Tonight we are discussing the relationship between science and politics, or perhaps more fully, science, politics, and the making of public policy and its implementation. These are big challenges for our society today because the rate of scientific and technological innovation is continuing to pick up, and many of the developments around the world are not just local or national, but truly interconnected at a global level. We have at UCSD a tradition, of course, of trying to break out of silos of narrow specializations to engage on a broader level intellectually, both for the purpose of discovery, but also for the purpose of service and education. And one of the developments that has grown over the last several years is that there is a collaboration between the science, engineering, and medical groups at UCSD and the School of Global Policy and Strategy to take many of our most promising young PhDs in the science and engineering fields and bring them to the study of policy, not by a set of formal courses, but by creating a mentorship program where, in a sense, for a year, these young scientists in the making are being mentored by faculty members at Global Policy and Strategy on the issues of how to engage in advice and design a policy for the great issues facing society today. Tonight, we have a panel that is going to help us explore some of the issues in that engagement of science, politics, and policy. We're lucky to have with us Christa Trexler, Allison Hutchings, Amber Mace, Margaret Leinen, and Congressman Scott Peters. I'll do more detailed introductions of all of them as it is their turn to speak. The plan is that they will each make remarks of 10 minutes, and then at the end we will save time for questions and answers. When we get to the question and answer period, you've already discovered on your seat a small index card, and that index card is available if you'd like to submit a question to the panel. Those index cards will be gathered up and they will be edited and shaped by my colleague on the GPS faculty, Professor Jennifer Burney. So with that said, let me just say a word or two about the issues that we are facing tonight. It's been my fortune as a scholar at UCSD to be deeply engaged in science and technology policy in my entire career, and I hold the Qualcomm Chair on Technology Policy here at UC San Diego. I've also been privileged to serve in both the Obama and Clinton administrations in the fields of economic policy, but with a large portfolio of science and technology issues in my portfolio. I just want to make one observation before I hand this over to my really skilled and interesting colleagues. And it's this. There is a tendency when scientists and engineers get engaged in public policy to hear them say, we just wish we had better communications. We have to train ourselves to be better communicators. And communications is, in my observation, a little like chicken soup. It certainly never helps, and sometimes it's just the right thing for getting you past the problem. But many of the issues about the engagement of science, technology, and medicine with the world of public policy is not just a matter that policymakers don't listen enough or scientists don't communicate clearly enough. It's that the solutions to the problems laid out in the scientific analysis don't neatly fit within the boxes that would be ideal in the world of science if it could just dictate policy for our day. There are compromises in politics. There are constraints on the economics of policy making. There are constraints on how well we can implement different types of solutions. And all those factors have to be thought through in order to find a sustainable and cohesive approach to resolving great issues that are confronting our society. So in the end, the engagement of science and politics and policy requires really two-way problem solving. The problem solving comes from the deep insights of science and technology and medicine, and the insights that come from those who at their best in the policymaking process understand what are the realistic parameters for shaping solutions to the problems that are being defined and outlined by scientists. And in that dialogue can come a type of creativity that guides both sides. We hope that the programs that we've instituted here at UCSD contribute to that dialogue, but tonight we're going to hear leaders of thought and action in this space. And so let's begin this evening with Christa Trexler and Allison Hutchings. They're the coordinators of the 500 Women Scientists San Diego Pod, and they're focusing, in fact, on promoting equality and inclusiveness while advocating for science in the community. They've established a terrific track record already while doing the rest of their careers. Allison is a senior project engineer at ATA Engineering. She's been involved in a number of industries. I noticed that not only was she in satellites and the launch vehicles for satellites, but she also has been involved in the roller coaster industry. And I don't know if that means that she's been on a wild ride for all of her career. Christa Trexler is a postdoctoral fellow in the cardiology department here at UCSD, and she's studying the mechanisms behind cardiac development and pathology. She's also an elected member of the chancellor here at UCSD's advisory committee on the status of women. So I am going to turn the forum over to them for now, and I'll rejoin you in a few minutes to introduce our next speaker. Allison and Christa.
Sorry, I had it up earlier.
As you can see, we don't yet live in a seamless digital technology world.
Do you know how to do it? Yeah, where is it? I'm not seeing it.
Here.
Okay, I knew it was over here. There we go.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Christa, and this is Allison. So we first wanted to start this off by kind of discussing what 500 Women Scientists actually is, because I'm guessing a lot of you haven't heard of it, but if you have, that's awesome. So we're both the coordinators of the San Diego Pod, but 500 Women Scientists is a women in science organization that also promotes inclusivity within science, but also within our communities. And we're a really new group. We've only been, the national organization has only been around since 2016. We actually formed in response to the 2016 election. So in response to all of the anti-science, as well as the sexism sentiments expressed throughout the whole election, as well as the conclusion, there was 5 women in Boulder, Colorado. They wrote an open letter that pledged to reaffirm their commitment to women in science, providing a community for women in science, but also promoting inclusivity within science, just to promote the whole scientific enterprise. And so they thought that, so they're going to send this letter out to have their colleagues and friends sign it to join them in this pledge. They thought that if they could get 500 people to sign it, that would be really awesome. And they actually reached that goal within 2 days. So that's where our name come from, because within 60 days, over 13,000 people across the world had signed it, and it just keeps growing. So currently we have over 20,000 people who've signed it. They're on our national mailing list, and we have over 250 pods across the world. So pods are just chapters. So groups of whales are matriarchal, and they're called pods, and we're also matriarchal. My mom thinks I run a podcast. That's not what this is. But so we run the San Diego pod, and we've been consistently active since February of this year. We revamped it after a period of dormancy. And we've really been spending this last 6 months just trying to make ourselves a space in the scientific community. Because San Diego has this amazing science community, science outreach, women in science advocacy community, and we're trying to be a part of that and also promote change. And so because we're a small but mighty group, we wanted to figure out how can we do this. And we're lucky that we've been in a midterm election year. So the whole goal of our group is that science is for everybody, right? Science affects every person every day, whether or not they think about it. But also policy affects every scientist every day, whether or not they want to admit it. A lot of scientists don't want to be political. So we thought what we could do is we could make a voter guide for our community and give the voters some information that isn't really publicly available. And it was geared for our community in general. So we came up with 6 questions. We crafted them ourselves that we agreed on that were really important for the scientific community within San Diego in general. So they focus on sexual harassment in STEM, inclusivity, the environment, global warming, climate change, immigration, dreamers, scientific integrity. Whether or not scientists think about it, these are things that affect them every single day. And we are a 501c3 organization, so this isn't to endorse anybody. That's not what this is about. It's just about making a platform for both of the candidates, and the voters have the information. So we sent this out to our national team and the other pods across the nation, and it actually spurred other pods across the nation to do the same thing. So now pods in New York, Colorado, DC, they've also made their own voter guides for their communities. So Allison's going to talk about how we did it.
Thank you. Okay, so how'd this go? We have this really dedicated small team working on reaching out to 17 different races. So there was 36 candidates ranging from state assembly races all the way up to the US Senate race. And we contacted them a lot. Calling, Twitter, email, showing up at campaign rallies sometimes and saying, why didn't you respond to our email? And once we actually got face-to-face interaction or got in contact with somebody, so that was a learning experience for us, somebody beyond just the initial email, we got really good responses from the people that actually responded. And so you can see we got 8 direct responses for our voter guide here, 7 Democrats and 1 Republican. And so for the races where there was a lot of publicly available information, we so from news articles and things like that, we pulled the quotes from that. We had in-person meetings with 2 campaigns, which were wonderful. And we put together voter guides for 7 races so far. And we have been promoting them on Twitter, on our website, social media. They're getting picked up in, the Twitter sphere, which is kind of fun. And so to give you an example of what we did, this is for the California 36. So this is just one of the questions. This is just one of the questions, and this is question 1 about harassment. And so in this campaign, we got responses from both candidates, Margie Castellano and Patricia Bates. And so that was really great to see the opinions coming from both of the 2 parties in the race. And so this has been a really learning experience for our group. And so one thing we wanted to bring was how can we do this better next time, and how can we interact with these different races and get more responses. And so one of the things we've decided was we need to get these questions distributed right as the primary finishes. So we delivered them in August?
Yeah.
Which wasn't maybe as much time for some of these smaller campaigns. Some of these local campaigns, turns out there's only, similar to our group size, there's probably only 5 or 6 people working on these small campaigns, and they're being inundated. And then we want to facilitate more face-to-face group meetings. And then we want to collaborate with more groups in San Diego, like some of the groups on campus here. So what's next? We will send these policy questions to the local politicians who have not been running this fall, so get some of their opinions. And then we're going to be working more on outreach with our group. And then we will continue to foster a community for women in science through meetups and other events. So I don't want to take up any more time, so thank you.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. And the idea of making science and technology issues one of those places that in a campaign requires a checklist of positions by political leaders is an important and interesting idea. Our next speaker this evening is going to be Dr. Amber Mace. She's the interim executive director of the California Council on Science and Technology. The council is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that was established at the request of the California State Legislature, and it is supported by the major research universities and federal research laboratories in California. Its mission under the charter from the state legislature is to provide the best scientific and technological advice in a nonpartisan way to the state of California leadership in government so that our policies can truly be science and engineering informed. Dr. Mace joined CCST in 2013. She is also a policy fellow at the UC Davis Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and the Economy. Prior to her work at CCST, she's held positions in a number of leading institutions dealing with science and technology policy, including the California Ocean Protection Council, the California Natural Resources Agency, and she was a fellow in the U.S. Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. Dr. Mace, I can tell you as the chair of the board of the California Council, is a terrific person at fostering the type of dialogue between scientists and policymakers that's essential to good policy. Dr. Mace.
Thanks, boss. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for bringing us together. Margaret, thank you for hosting us. And thanks to my panelists. This is a fun conversation to have. It's an honor to be here tonight to give you a little bit of my perspective on how science informs policy at the state level. How many of you think it's a good idea for science to inform policy? All right. No, not all the hands went up. I'm curious about that. How many of you who produce knowledge would like your knowledge to be useful and informative to policymakers? How many of you feel like that's happening or you know how to do that? Okay, not very many. How many of you like to learn more about how to do that? All right, great. Well, you came to the right place. And you have I'm hoping that this is just the beginning of a conversation for you, right? That you can connect with each other, that you connect with the panelists, and that we can just give you a taste of how this works and what the opportunities are. There are so many ways that your knowledge, that what you're working on, can be applied to decision making. And this can be at the local level, and you heard the wonderful work that Allison and Christa are doing in engaging at the local level. There's the regional level, there's the state level, national and international. There's also different aspects of government. There's the executive branch and the legislature, and this is at the state level, and the judiciary, and then at the federal level the same. So there are all these different pathways. And so you want to be thinking about that landscape and where you want to plug in and also how you want to plug in. And I'll talk a little bit about that too. I'll talk about what I've learned in this process. And being a scientist myself, I wanted to understand why science doesn't inform policy very well. Like, what are the barriers? So after I finished my graduate program in marine ecology, at UC Davis, I went on to, rather than doing science postdocs, I thought of them as policy postdocs, and I wanted to better understand decision making at the state level and at the federal level. So I did one in Sacramento and one in Washington, D.C. And so those of you who are interested in this space, I encourage you to try out these fellowship type opportunities because they open these doors to these worlds that you may not otherwise have an opportunity to engage in. And they're really fabulous programs, and we run one ourselves, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in just a couple minutes. And it was through these experiences that I got to see firsthand some of these barriers, and it really comes down to cultural differences. And Peter mentioned the constraints, and that's truly what they are, that the academic realm and the policymaking realm, the people that work in each speak different languages, they operate on different time frames, they have different incentives, they have different basic constraints. Some of them are similar, like they are in the academic realm and the policy realm, complexity, like both systems are highly complex. But where decision makers get their information is very different than where scientists get their information. And for instance, decision makers get information from people that they know and trust. And that might be their staff in their offices, it might be a lobbyist, it might be the newspaper. It's not often that it's a peer-reviewed journal article. It's not often that it's at a conference. And so we think about how there's just this kind of lack of an intersection. And one of the things that I've learned in the work that I've done is that we need to create these opportunities for connection, and we need to build relationships. And as Peter said, it's not just as simple as being good communicators. Yes, we want to train you to be excellent communicators. That's essential, but it's not sufficient. So we also need to help create these opportunities for you to engage and meet the people who are making decisions, because once they get to know you, then they're more likely to call on you and tap into the expertise that you're producing. And that's absolutely essential for what we do. And so one of the ways we do that at the California Council on Science and Technology, in fact, we do that in a number of different ways. Historically, we have done that through producing peer-reviewed reports like the National Academies produces. And this has been kind of the bread and butter of the organization. This is something that our most recent board chair, Charlie Kennel, has just been absolutely tremendous in helping lead the way for the California Council on Science and Technology to make an impact on really meaty issues for the state. These reports take time to produce, sometimes a couple years. And the decision makers are making decisions about how they allocate resources in the matter of hours, days, weeks, and maybe the political calendar. And so how do we do a better job of tapping in and providing that advice on a relevant time frame? And so we've established a number of different mechanisms, and this is where we can tap into your expertise. We can do it by organizing briefings, we can put together workshops, we can write white papers, but I think our secret weapon, it's not very secret, but it's our most powerful weapon, is a fellowship program that we've created, that we've modeled after the AAAS fellowship at the federal level, where we take PhD scientists and engineers, 10 of them, and we train them for a month, and then we place them in the California legislature. And they serve as staff. Now, this is the best way, hands down, to break down these barriers, because they are trusted members of the team. So decision makers are faced every day with the just overwhelming amount of information that they have to sort through what's credible and what's not. They have what we call combat science, where stakeholders from different perspectives will come in and say, this is what the science says, and then the next meeting will come in and say, and this is what the science says, and they conflict. And so how is a decision maker going to, in the time frame that they have, sort through that? So our scientists help them evaluate that type of information in real time. And so we've just seen this as a wonderful way to make these connections. And then our scientists and engineers are hired after they complete their fellowship into state service. And so now this is the pipeline of science informing decision making. So now there are many, many scientists in Sacramento pulling science in. And so it's just, I think, a really great example of one of the most important take-home messages that I want you to walk away with tonight from my presentation, is that relationships matter. That, again, decision makers get their information from people they know and trust. And we want to help create more two-way dialogues so that decision makers can hear from scientists and scientists can hear from decision makers and understand what each other needs. And that we as an organization, the California Council on Science and Technology, can help foster those interactions, because they are not just going to happen on their own. They need translators, and they need people who are willing to understand both sides and serve in that translator role. So I will leave it at that and hope that we have time for a good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. Let me emphasize the point that Amber made about the science staff members becoming a member of the team. We met with a member of the California legislature just a few weeks ago who had a science policy fellow, and he said, we weren't sure we wanted one of these people. We didn't know that they spoke our language or even liked jokes. And evidently this guy was really good at drinking beer, and it broke down all the barriers in a hurry. So our next panelist is our host here at Scripps. She's the Vice Chancellor for Marine Sciences here at UCSD and the Director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. She is also a very distinguished scientist, an ocean biogeochemist, and paleoceanographer. Her research has included study of ocean carbon cycling and the role of the ocean in climate. She is also, in a sense, a science statesman. She is the former president of the American Geophysical Union, which is the largest geoscience society in the world, and she served as the president of the Oceanography Society. I could go through many other honors that have been bestowed on her, but in her time in government has included being the assistant director for geosciences at the U.S. National Science Foundation, and she served as the vice chair of the U.S. Climate Change Science Program. Margaret Leinen truly has extensive experience at an exceptional level to share with us tonight in reflecting on her time both as a leader in scientific organizations and also a real mover and shaker in government. Dr. Leinen, thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter, and welcome everyone, especially anyone who hasn't visited Scripps before. We're really happy to join GPS and provide a venue for this really nice event. So the folks at GPS asked me to talk a little bit about science and policy from a couple perspectives. One, from my time at National Science Foundation, and they said, you know, how do the science priorities really get set, and how influenced are they by politics? And how does NSF interact with the political system, especially Congress? And then they also asked me to talk a little bit about professional societies and how they interact in the public policy and politics realm. So NSF really, it's, well, and I think that most of what I say about NSF is also applicable to most of the other science agencies like NOAA, NIH, NASA, the U.S. Geological Survey, the science enterprise within Department of Energy. Everybody assumes that when an administration changes in Washington, that somebody in the administration goes down to those agencies and says, okay, now it's going to be this way. And especially I think that if you read, if you'd been reading the news about science agencies over the last 2 years, you would have read a lot that would suggest to you that the science agencies are really captive to the political system. And probably one of the great things about our particular system is the inertia in it. And the fact that it takes a long time to move the supertanker of an agency or any part of government. And that really means that we're sort of freed from those really rapid or whipsaw-like changes. So NSF really sets its priorities in both a top-down, an in-out, and a bottom-up way. So it's certainly true that administrations talk to NSF and all the other science agencies. Every year there's a letter that comes from the head of the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the head of the Office of Management and Budget, and it goes to the agencies and it says, here's your guidance in setting up your budget for the year about things we're concerned about. And that's a very general letter. And some of those big ideas, like, for example, we're interested in cybersecurity and how our world is going to be affected by cybersecurity. Or we're really interested in the issues of cultural differences and how they are affecting our scientific workforce. So you might get comments like that. And then it's up to the agency to interpret what in their scientific program is appropriate to that. And it might mean that, for example, at NSF, that with cybersecurity, that some emphasis was put on the budget of the computer sciences division, the engineering division, the cyber infrastructure division. But it doesn't mean that NSF goes, okay, we're going to go this way now. Then there's so that's sort of a top-down pressure on NSF. Then there's also the bottom-up pressure. So the scientific voice for the agencies is really extraordinarily strong. They really listen to the scientific community. And one of the challenges is how do you get your voice heard at the level of an agency? And there are many mechanisms. Some of the mechanisms are studies by the National Academy. Some of them are planning exercises within the agencies, for example, advisory committees and so forth. Some of them are program officers' sense of what's exciting in the field from going to listen to all of you at scientific meetings. And then there's sort of the in-out sense of the other forces and other factors in society that seem to be really important. For example, NSF is really concerned these days about what the whole Internet of Things combined with the inherent insecurities of the internet mean for our vulnerability in the future. And that's something that didn't really come up through an advisory committee or a National Academy study, but really came from listening to what the country wants. So when it comes to dealing with Congress, Congress meets with agencies to talk about budget. I mean, there are two big kinds of input that Congress wants. One is, how much money does it take to do what you want? What do you want to do? And how do we reach an agreement about that? And the other is on policy issues. And the science agencies they're only one voice on policy. And some of the processes that Amber talked about are equally, if not more, important. But Congress also makes it a point, especially those who have a role in setting up the budgets for science, the committees that have appropriations responsibilities and oversight responsibilities, really do make an effort to get around to see some of the science. And these congressional delegations, CODELs as they're referred to, go out to look at especially major scientific efforts. The staff try to make it around during recesses and so forth to see what's going on and to form their own opinion as well. And then the budget hearings and testimony are also opportunities to have input. But I think the major message I want to leave you with that is that there are the science enterprise and its influence on policy is one that has a lot of long-term influence and a lot of opportunity at long-term, and by that I mean over years and multiple years, as opposed to, okay, we're going to take a right turn or a left turn or a 180-degree turn, and the whole science enterprise is whipped around. Professional societies have a different role, and especially for those of you who are early career members of science, it's really important for you to get involved with the science societies that represent your field. Most of them have very low dues for students. Some of them also have lower dues for early career members. And almost all are really looking for opportunities to bring early career scientists into their structure, into their membership, into their committees, because there's a very, very strong feeling that you are the future and that we want to hear from you. So some of, at the national level, many of these organizations have the kind of internship and fellowship opportunities that Amber described. And the halls of Congress are peopled with a lot of scientists who went there as interns in congressional offices, on committee staffs, et cetera, and are really, they become great resources, not just for their own personal expertise, but for their understanding of who to go to and who to consult with. And so most of the people who wind up giving testimony in front of Congress are people who were recommended to the senators and the members by staffers who are familiar. So those are all people who came from our community and who play a very important role. The other thing is that the scientific societies get to know the members, and they recommend people who are experts in the field. So American Geophysical Union, for which I served as president, was called on routinely to recommend people to testify before Congress, to talk with staffers, to talk with members of Congress themselves about major issues. So these are all ways that you can use the resources that you have to be able to talk to science and talk to policy as well. And the last thing that I want to emphasize is that all of government, whether it's agencies or whether it's Congress, are looking for leadership, and they're looking for good ideas. And don't be afraid to speak up. Don't be afraid to push your ideas forward. It often takes a long time to realize something, but every great project in your field that you look at and you say, I'm so proud that I'm a biologist and that we're doing that, came from somebody like you who just stuck with it and kept moving that through this entire process and had that vision and that capability. And it's the science itself as well as the people who speak to policy. Thanks.
Thanks very much. The president often rails against the deep state, but as I think Margaret was pointing out, much of that is because the expertise and knowledge necessary to do much of the hard work of governance moves in a longer time scale based on the people and the resources and the understanding that takes a long time to build. And this is a very important infrastructure, a resource for America as a thought and policy leader in the world. So our last panelist is, in a sense, the ideal closing panelist at this point, because he's the person that everybody's trying to inform. And on the other side, from my perspective, he's the person responding in the dialogue that they better listen to in response. So our final panelist is, of course, Congressman Scott Peters, who represents our own 52nd congressional district since he was first elected in 2012. Congressman Peters has built a reputation in Washington in his service on the House Energy and Commerce Committee as a real advocate for the investment in science and technology in the United States. He's kept a special eye on the concerns of San Diego and its science and discovery ecosystem. And he has also been a strong advocate in regards to healthcare issues, both for the country as a whole, but also in regards to his service on the House Committee on Veterans Affairs. So, Congressman Peters, we're very grateful you could take the time to be with us tonight, and let me give you the podium.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. Thanks to Margaret for hosting us in really one of the finest buildings in San Diego County. This is such a great place. I hope you don't get used to it. Congratulations to Christa and Allison on what you're doing. I wish you well and hope to work with you. And then Amber, I envy you for being in California. California, if you want to be in a place that's about science and innovation and thinking about solving tomorrow's problems, it's California. And I have one foot in California. I have another foot in the other place. Which sort of culturally is the anti-California. It's very much built on hierarchy and grudges and so forth. But let me just talk a little bit about the context in which I work. And I do think that there's a concern that facts are under siege that affects science. Michael Hayden has a book out, I think it's called The Assault on Intelligence. He talks about how under this administration, the things we use to evaluate what's true, science, but also the judiciary and journalism, are really criticized by this president in a very overt way because in many cases, in dealing with the facts, present some really difficult policy challenges. And I want to say also that I had a experience, my first term, I was on the science committee. We used to say science committee with air quotes. And one of the people on the other side was a guy named Dana Rohrabacher, who represents us up north. And came to testify at our committee was Ernest Moniz, the Secretary of Energy, super smart guy, terrible haircut. But he was so smart he could get away with that haircut. And he was testifying, and Mr. Rohrabacher challenged him, and he said, look, he says, this is what he literally said. He says, look, you went to MIT, and I went to Long Beach State, but here's how I see it. He said, we had just gone through Superstorm Sandy. He said, in 1910, there was a storm that was just as big as Superstorm Sandy. So why are you telling me that there's any change? Now, he didn't know anything about bell curves or anything like that. He was very open about how he understood it, and it was very evident that he didn't understand it. And I will give him the benefit of saying that that was a capacity issue, not a political issue. But he was a little bit overmatched and proud of it. Not very humble about his knowledge about science. And in that committee, by the way, the chairman, Lamar Smith, a sweet guy, was very concerned about how science would be reviewed, whether peer review is really the right way, or whether some non-scientists should be involved in the review of science. Now, you don't get that in California, but that's a pretty stunning kind of thing. Now, because of what Margaret said about the inertia of federal agencies, we've been able to fend off a lot of these bad ideas because they kind of bounce off the system, but it's a totally different thing sometimes. So how do you operate in that kind of context? Well, first of all, keep doing good science. I mean, the whole thing falls apart if your science doesn't have integrity. So congratulations on what you're doing. Keep at it. Do it the right way and work on these tough problems. For me, by the way, my connection with science as a policymaker has come mostly from what I'm interested in my district. This district, parenthetically, the 10th best educated congressional district in the country out of 435, which shouldn't surprise you if you think a little bit about it. We really depend on science and technology in many ways. Our biggest private employer is Qualcomm. And we have biotechnology all around here. We are a leader in genomics. And so by virtue of my trying to serve my district, I learned a little bit about science. One of the most profound visits I made was I went to the Salk Institute when I was a candidate. This is before I'm elected to Congress, but these researchers heard that someone who might be in Congress was coming to the Salk, and so they filled up this little conference room with, some of these top scientists just to tell me what was going on. And the upshot of what they told me was, in the good times when NIH was funded to a certain level, 25% of grants would be funded in this really competitive peer-reviewed system, and it had gotten down to where it was 7 to 9%, which meant that young people maybe thought that science wasn't a good career for them, or that maybe a different country would be a good career for them to pursue science. And that really made a big impact. I mean, that brought home why it was important for me to fight to increase the NIH budget. So that was a really important visit for me. And I have other scientists now. When I was working as a port commissioner, I got to know a guy named Neil Driscoll who wanted to map the bottom of the bay, and we came up with a partnership of this institution, I think it was through Scripps, because it turns out we have the best climate scientists in the world right here, an ocean scientist, and we worked together with him, the port and San Diego State and Scripps Oceanography to come up with a center on bay and coastal dynamics that would look at the bay. Again, I thought it was better than hiring a consultant, some consultant off the work list. We had these great scientists to work with here. I got to be friends with a guy named Steve Mayfield. There's a whole algae research happening here, and at the point when I was elected and oil prices were a little higher, I'm interested in climate. Climate is what I did environmental law for a long time. Climate's the national issue I'm interested in. I heard about the algae research here. It could be used as an alternative fuel. So now I have a algae surfboard hanging in my office, but one here and one there. I pay for them both. They've never seen the water, but they look good. And I understand. I'm also co-chair of the bipartisan Congressional Algae Caucus. Now you didn't know there was a bipartisan congressional. So we are the pond scum politicians. If you don't like my algae jokes, they grow on you. I get to spend a lot of time on the plane. I would say that the allure of domestic air travel is gone, but I do read a lot on the plane. I was reading an op-ed in the paper, in the New York Times, about short-lived climate pollutants, methane, black carbon, and hydrofluorocarbons. And it's explained to me why, because they're not persistent in the atmosphere, that if you could eliminate these agents, which are much more damaging in the short run, from the mix, you could really slow the rate of climate change. And I looked at the bottom, and the guy is a professor at UCSD, at Scripps, Ramanathan, Dr. Ram. So I called the guy up, and we got to be friendly. I invited him to DC. He briefed a whole bunch of staffers on this whole thing. We came up with a bill. We call them super pollutants, a term I coined and President Obama used. And to talk about how to coordinate an effort that would really retard the release of these particular dangerous pollutants. So he's kind of my climate scientist. By the way, he calls me up a few weeks later. He says, it turns out he's also the Pope's climate scientist. And he says to me, I got this conference coming up, and I need someone to speak to the Vatican about Congress in Rome. Do you think you could make it? I said, I think we can make that happen. So at his suggestion, I spoke to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences about what was wrong with Congress, really. I mean, Jerry Brown was there, too. He talked about what was right with California. I had to talk about what was wrong with Congress. And I'd be happy to invite you to see. I did a 10-minute presentation on what went wrong from the Republican Party. But there's a lot of good news out there. And I would say, for me, having scientists in my orbit has always been pretty important. Let me tell you a few things about communication that may be different for you, and I do think it is different. When I was a trial lawyer, I had to put chemists and toxicologists on the stand, and I learned, that what you wanted to say at the beginning isn't really what these folks are going to take in. And so I've done a lot of, I think it's a little bit like translating. But it's not just that. it's that people hear things differently. And so I want to give you a couple suggestions. I do want you to have relationships with people if they're interested, like me. We have people getting elected to Congress all the time. There may be something you see in their area that's of interest. If you're in Davis, right? Sacramento. So, up there's science around agriculture that people need to know about. I know Jimmy Panetta is my friend up there. He's interested in that too. So having a relationship with people like me is good. Don't discount the staff. I have staff members in the back. Anthony, Aaron, and Martha are the kind of people that they'll be in the meeting with me, and I might get 20 minutes with you, but they're the ones who are going to remind me of what you said. So, feel free to keep talking to them. Don't feel like you have to send me an email. Talk to them is really important. Talk locally. I just saw a guy, Bill Cooney. I haven't seen him forever. He did a really important thing here with science communication. We have, like I said, we have the best climate scientists. Bill funded an effort that became the Climate Initiative at the San Diego Foundation. Based on the science you did, he saw the science out here that no one, and he put it into a report, the 2050 report, to show the effects that climate change would have on this county. So finding people like Bill in your midst, that helped me learn it's sea level rise, it's drought, and it's more intense wildfires. It's still the same, by the way. I still think that's basically what we're facing here. So you can look for community agents to help you spread your science. A guy who's doing really good communications about science is Al Gore, if you've seen the way he does it. He does a 2-hour PowerPoint, if you can go to his training, out of which he'll tell you, take parts of it you need to explain. He trains you how to talk to people about it. I think that might be something for a scientist to sit in. It's not made for scientists, it's made for lay people who want to spread the word about climate. But it's a really effective way, I think, to communicate these concepts. But I want to just say one more thing that I thought was the most profound thing I heard when I was in Rome. I met, of course, the Pope has been pushing climate change as a moral issue, for which I'm grateful as a Christian. But I met a bunch of evangelicals there who told me something I didn't understand, and that was that their people are concerned not about statistics and not about polar bears, but they're concerned about their children and their grandchildren. And I had been missing the boat, because I will talk about bell curves. I know enough science to be dangerous. And I can sort of explain, how the climate is changing, more moisture in the air, so forth, the stuff that you all teach me about here. But we have to meet people where they are. And what I learned about evangelicals is that they want to hear about this in the context of how does this affect my children and my grandchildren. There's a climate scientist, her name is Catherine Hayhoe at Texas Tech. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's an evangelical climate scientist at Texas Tech. And I might draw your attention to her in terms of a style for dealing with people. So it's still science, but it's also thinking about your audience and what they want to hear is about the ramification. Don't believe that people don't trust science, okay? All these people that say they don't trust scientists, the doctor tells them to take a statin, they take it the next day. That's just because they trust science. There's a politicization of it. What I think it's really important to do is keep doing what you're doing, do your science with integrity, tell your neighbors and your community about it. If you have a wonderfully accommodating political context like we have in California, push it, take advantage of it, but don't give up on poor Washington, D.C., because even though I think we're behind the curve on a lot of these things, we can make a big difference. And I look forward to the discussion. Thanks for having me.